Hi everyone, welcome to another interview. Today we're joined by Songbringer's Nathanael Weiss. We're really fortunate to have him here today and talk to us, and hopefully we can get to know a little bit more about the game because it's coming to Xbox One very soon, September 1 to be exact. Nathanael, I'll just hand it over to you. Before instead of me going on about the game, how about you just tell us a little about Songbringer and sort of like the development process behind it, like the thoughts, the inspirations.
Sure. Well, Songbringer is like basically it's a procedural Zelda 1. As far as the development goes, it's been a one-man project for about 2 of the years, and now this last year I've been backed by a publisher, a wonderful, awesome publisher named Double 11, and they've helped me get to expos and get the game ported to consoles, Xbox, and PlayStation. And it's been a really amazing experience. At the beginning, it was I did a Kickstarter, and now here we are 3 years later.
Oh wow! How much did you generate in the Kickstarter, and what's the allocation been for those funds?
Well, I asked for 9,000, and at first the project was scoped a lot smaller. I thought that I would be creating something a lot like the very first Legend of Zelda, where you could only move in like 4 directions, and everything kind of looked 8-bit and stuff like that. And then basically the project grew in its scope over the years, and it grew into way more than that. So I thought I was only going to need like 6 months worth of funding. And it turns out I needed more like 3 years. So this basically it did last about 6 months, 6 to 9 months that funding lasted me. So, and without the Kickstarter, this never would have happened. So I mean, I'm eternally thankful to all those people that back Songbringer, and I actually am looking forward to doing another Kickstarter for my next game.
All right. Well, we'll get to your next game towards the end, but before we spoke, I did some research into Songbringer, and I noticed how even, for example, the robot character Jib has somewhat of an extensive backstory. So how important is like storytelling to you, and how do you present it in Songbringer? Like, for example, how do you incorporate this rich lore into the game?
Well, it is very important to me, and I didn't really realize how important storytelling was until I started writing a game with story in it. And so I started paying attention really a lot to Netflix. I started watching Netflix and being like, how is this story being told? What is it that I like about stories? What is it in a story that I love? And I love when there's surprises. I love when characters have deep backstories and you really get invested with characters. I love it when things are thrown to the brink of destruction. I love it when things like all the characters are almost dead. It's like, what the heck just happened? Like, I love moments like that in games. So that's why I've always tried to basically write as much backstory as possible for every character and everything in the world, so that, or at least to leave open the door so that some backstory could be written at some point. So that it just feels like you can emotionally connect with the characters and the universe.
That's understandable. So, did you conceive the story of Songbringer even before development, or was it kind of like an evolutionary process?
Well, the overall concept, yes, was before development. I had a general concept that this is what the world would be like, and this is what the characters would be like, and this is what they're kind of going to do. But it changed a lot, because I'm one of those developers that likes to try things out and then see how it feels, and then change things and iterate. So it kind of iterated into something even more than I thought it would be. And there's really some surprises and twists in the story of Songbringer that I never had expected, but I just felt like this is going to be the most emotionally impactful thing that could happen in this storyline.
That's great. So considering you're just a one-man studio pretty much, how difficult was it to incorporate procedural generation in the game? I know some games you can just procedurally generate, you don't retain seeds. But retaining seeds, is that another sort of step, or does it sort of kind of merge into procedural generation?
Well, as far as the seeds go, that is basically just a way so that you can get the same world anytime you want. So basically, if you play world Peanut, Peanut's always going to look like Peanut, and all the bosses are going to be in the same place and stuff like that. So it's just something so that if you want to play the same world, in fact, if you wanted to play Songbringer as if it wasn't even a procedural game, you would just enter the same world seed every time, and you could get familiar with where the secrets are and the order of the bosses, and you could get really good at playing one world, like speedrunning it, for example. And then if you want to surprise yourself and you want a completely new adventure, you can throw in a different seed. And as far as procedural and being how difficult it is to develop, it was I've been mostly a programmer for my career of development, so I feel like this is something that I'm accomplished with at this point in my life. I've been a programmer for over 20 years, so I really feel like I had this, and I had concepts for how to create a Zelda-like procedural game for over a decade. I've always been wanting to do something like this, and I'm really glad to be doing it at this point. And it was quite challenging to make the world feel like it was a bespoke, handcrafted, custom-designed world while still integrating procedural elements. And what I did there was to basically just write algorithms. In fact, Songbringer never ever saves any of its data to disk. So when you enter that world seed and you start a game, it's actually generating the entire world every time you play. So, and it's all based on algorithms. So it's not like I went and hand designed some rooms and then randomly stitched them all together at runtime. This is actually, everything depends on what's around it. Like there might be a river running through the world that changes all of the areas near it, or a lake or something like that. So, I've spent a lot of time handcrafting the algorithms for the procedural aspect of the game, so that I hope it really does feel like a bespoke game.
I know, because many of our readers, we were discussing this with a group on our Mixer stream the other day. So I think one of the concerns people have nowadays is how, I guess, Diablo 3 initially advertised itself as a procedural game, but it was more about stitching random areas together instead of actually having, algorithms that generated incredible variety. So that's great to hear. Because nowadays, in the gaming industry, we kind of have to make a distinction between procedural generation and just stitching together different levels in order to create like a new experience.
Yeah, I really hope more games start to do that, to make that distinction, because it really is it's a different level of procedural when you're doing it that way. Yeah.
So apparently dungeons play a major role in Songbringer, and are they supposed to represent like the ultimate challenge in Songbringer, or I mean, what do you think of as sort of like what incredibly hardcore gamers will invest their time in?
Yeah. Okay. So here's the ultimate challenge with Songbringer. Don't pick up the sword. Basically, play the entire game without the main weapon, and try and beat the final boss as soon as you can without defeating any of the dungeons. So you can play Songbringer out of order. Like you don't have to do all the dungeons. There's really only 2 dungeons that have to be there's really only there's really only 1 dungeon that has. Wait, maybe 2. 1 or 2 dungeons that basically have to be completed. So you could get to the final boss with only 3 or 4 life containers. And it's super duper difficult to beat the final boss, even with full life and these things called flasks, which refill all your health. Even if you had flasks and full life, it's still a really difficult fight. So I'm thinking the ultimate challenge for the hardcore gamer is to just jump straight into the final boss fight as soon as you can with as little as possible. And I guarantee it will be difficult because I've actually played through the whole game without the sword, and it took me a full month to finally beat the final boss.
Oh, wow.
Without the sword. Just trying again and again and again. I finally was like, okay, this is how you do it. You really got to dodge all these attacks and get this process down just right. So I think it'll be quite challenging. And then I'm eventually going to be adding more items and things like that and updates. And one of them I want to create is a ring of difficulty. So it'll make it even more difficult. Like all the enemies will have twice as much health and stuff like that. And that'll be like an optional item.
So that's quite an undertaking, I must say. So what are some of the abilities in the game you have, for example, and what are some of, for example, the ways you can sort of gain health, etc., etc. For example, I know there's the ability, for example, cacti play a major role in the game, as well as meditation. So if you could just talk to us a little about that.
Sure. The first thing to realize about Songbringer is that you start with nothing. You start with absolutely nothing. You don't even have the sword. All you can do is just move your character around. So you kind of learn as you go. You get the sword. You learn how it works. You get the bombs. You learn how they work. Bombs are cool because they can blow up walls, but they can also damage enemies. And then you've also got this top hat you can throw like a boomerang, so that can pick up items, and it can also become a weapon. And then you also have a blink ability, which allows you to dash forward and like dodge enemy attacks and things like that. All these things can be upgraded. Well, not actually, just the blink can be upgraded 3 times, and so you can finally get to jump really farther and farther. And then you've got crafting. So crafting is a huge part of it, like where you have 5 different elements. There's ice, fire, lightning, acid, which is kind of like poison, and then fear. And fear is like opposite of everything else. As you get weaker, it gets stronger. So it's kind of a unique element. Those 5 elements can be combined with all of your weapons in any order you want. So like you might craft, in one of your runs, you might craft a poison top hat that like poisons all the enemies. And in another run, maybe you craft a fiery top hat, which you can light everything on fire. So that basically creates a lot of variety for how your eventual item and ability loadout plays out. Like you have all 5 of those things can be combined with all 5 of your different weapons, so you have a completely different loadout. And then the items really have a lot of overlap too. For example, and this is so that players can have a choice how they solve problems. Like there's one time where you have to get over these like ice. There's water. And you have to get over the water somehow. And you can get over the water by having ice. So you craft like maybe one of your weapons with ice so that you can freeze the water. Or you can get the level 3 blink orb, which allows you to blink over it. Or, let me think. I can't really think of any other way to do it right now. But a lot of the blocks and the gate items in the world are meant to be things that can be overcome in multiple ways, so that you really feel creative as a player how you're solving each problem.
That's definitely interesting to know, and our readers will definitely appreciate it. The last thing we just want to talk about were the cacti and the meditation.
Okay. Yeah, the cacti and the meditation. The cacti basically are your superpower almost. You eat these cacti and you gain back a little bit of health, and you get these psychedelic powers where you're able to see through walls. And it's a way for the character to grow. So he starts eating these cacti and he gets these powers, and eventually he learns how to meditate as well. And meditation becomes almost the same as the cacti. And so you've got these 2 different abilities that allow you to reveal secrets. So eat a cactus or sit down and meditate, and you would see that there's a bush that has something underneath it, and you can go over to that bush, light it on fire, and there's a secret. Or maybe there's a wall that could be bombed through, and you meditate near it, and you see, oh, that wall has a crack in it. So it's kind of an interesting way to reveal where secrets are without it being too obvious.
That's perfect. Clearly you mentioned the sword multiple times, and it plays a major role. But can you talk a little more about the mechanics of the sword? For example, what are sort of some of the abilities we have when we're fighting enemies, etc., etc.?
Mm-hmm. Well, the sword is just a melee weapon, so you attack enemies from a short distance. But then later you also get this upgrade to it called the Ghost Sword, and the Ghost Sword is a lot like The Legend of Zelda's Master Sword, where it shoots out a sword projectile, but it works a little bit differently in that if you're at maximum health, the Ghost Sword will go its maximum distance. But as your health starts dropping, it starts going a little bit less far and less far and less far. So when you're like basically almost dead, it only goes a tiny distance. And then if you craft the Ghost Sword with fear, you create the Fear Sword, and the Fear Sword works exactly the opposite mechanic. So when you're at full health, the Fear Sword is weakest, and it just barely goes a certain distance. But then when you're at one life container left, it goes super far and does, it's just a really powerful weapon at that point.
So going back to a little bit about the development process, obviously you're the one person developing the game. So what have been some of the challenges? I mean, did you pretty much know how to develop a game from the beginning, or was it more like a learning process? Yeah, how did that go?
Well, I knew how to make games already. I've been making games for over 20 years, so I knew about all this. But really the challenging part for me was art. I had never made a game art before, so this is my first art project. And if you look back at like if you go to my old TIG source or scroll through old GIFs of Songbringer, it really has progressed a lot. And honestly, the art sucked at first, and that was the biggest challenge for me. I was like, are people ever going to want to play something with crappy programmer art in it? And I thought my art was really crappy at first, but what I did was I did a lot of live streams, and almost like 5 days a week at one point I was doing live streams. And a lot of times I would get feedback from people like, hey, maybe you should try this with the art or that with the art. And even good artists started coming on my live stream and giving me tips. And so I just got a little bit better and a little bit better as the time went on. And I feel like at this point it could pass as an artistic game. And so that was the biggest challenge for me, was learning how to make art.
How long did that take you?
Oh, sorry.
Just the process of perfecting the visuals?
This is 3 years.
Oh, wow.
Into it, yeah.
So going back to the mechanics of the game in general, so as you said, you pretty much start off with nothing, and it's a procedural game. You can play different worlds pretty much every single run. So how hard it was to forgo traditional progression methods? Is that something... So how do you sort of maintain that sense of satisfaction gamers feel? You know, for example, when you like level up, you gain experience. You gain. So how do you maintain the balance of having no experience but still making the user feel that they're gaining in multiple ways?
Well, it's really you gain when you defeat bosses, when you vanquish enemies and you find items. So you're rewarded for exploring and for conquering. Yeah, and or at least like bringing more peace to the world or something like that. So you haven't actually. It's not based on how many enemies you killed, but it does make you have to defeat a certain number of enemies and get through a certain dungeon and have you've actually earned it as a player when you level. You don't actually level up, but you get another life container, and you really have earned it at that point as a player. So I think that kind of works in its own way. It's not a traditional RPG in a sense, but it is still rewarding and something that you have to put effort into to make happen.
So you mentioned that you actually found a publisher recently. Did you go through the ID at Xbox program or through other traditional methods when developing for Xbox One?
Oh no! So that's all handled by my publisher, Double 11. They're amazing, and they're the ones doing the Xbox and the PlayStation ports, basically. So they contacted me through the Kickstarter. That's how our relationship started, and I'm incredibly thankful to them for having done all that. They're pros. They've already been through the Xbox program, and they know it in and out. They know all the requirements and the approval process and the everything from like certifications and all that stuff. There's a lot involved with releasing an Xbox game. There's no way I would have been able to do this alone, and I'm thankful to them for that.
This is somewhat of an offbeat question, but so the Xbox One X was pretty much revealed a couple of days ago, properly, pre-orders and everything. And do you have plans to upgrade Songbringer for Xbox One S? I mean, I know the visuals are, for example, pixelated, so, I don't know how much of an upgrade would be just to increase the resolution from, 1080p to 4K, but do you have any plans for that? What about your future game?
Songbringer will always be, the pixels in Songbringer will always be this size. I'm never going to change the resolution. But that when you play Songbringer at any resolution, it always scales up. So it's no matter whether you're playing at 1080p or 4K, it's still going to look, it's still going to be full screen. It's still going to look the way it is. But it will never ever change its actual, how big an actual pixel is, because that's just how this game has been written. And I can't change it at this point. And if I did, it would ruin the aesthetic.
That's understandable. I suppose, I mean, it's always interesting to ask developers because sometimes like increasing resolution, increasing, for example, like the amount of information or visuals seen on screen can dramatically change the game. But sometimes, obviously, there's a balance between, what your game is versus what it becomes if you alter all of these parameters.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that The Legend of Zelda was like a big inspiration for the game. So what are the other games you've been inspired by? For example, I think the flask mechanic initially came from, I believe, Prince of Persia back in the day.
Actually, that was inspired by the Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, when you have, a fairy in a bottle and it brings you back to life. That's kind of what that was inspired by. But Prince of Persia, that's a really good example of something else that's done a similar mechanic. Other games that it's been inspired by are like Secret of Mana. That's a big one. Crystallis, for the NES. It's a kind of a rarer game, but it's super classic. I love that game. And then more recent titles, the art style has really been inspired by like Sword and Sorcery. It's a freaking amazing game, such an atmospheric, like amazing work of art. I love that game. And other great pixel art titles recently, like Crawl and Hyperlight Drifter, and other games in this pixel art genre have really helped to shape, how. Because right now, as game developers, we're taking these 8-bit sized pixels and we're throwing in 32-bit colors and seeing what we can do. And so it's been inspiring to look at what other people are doing and also try and do my own unique thing. And with doing unique stuff, I've really tried to work on shaders a lot. So if you were to take away all the shaders from Songbringer, it definitely wouldn't look as good. So.
And going back to another point you made earlier about you've been in the industry for 20 years. So what are some of the games you've worked on, and what are some of the, for example, let's just say the engines you've worked on in the past?
Yeah, I've kind of been indie since before there was indie. I released my own video game when I was in a sophomore in high school. I was 15 years old, and it was for DOS. I wrote this game about chickens in space and saving the chickens. And it was a funny freshman, sophomore style. I was very immature at that point. So I've been making games for, just kind of doing my own indie thing for a while. A publisher picked me up towards the end of high school, and I published a few games. And then I took a long hiatus. So I actually took a long time off. I was tired of being, I was tired of always dealing with the problems of computers. I wanted to learn more about the world, and I traveled the world for a little while. I learned to make music, and it really helped me to kind of expand as a creator and an artist. And then in the 2010s, I came back into the whole game development world. But I've also, for a short while, I also worked for Trilobite, which was, they made The Seventh Guest and The 11th Hour back in the 90s. And I also worked for another company from my hometown in the early 2000s. So I worked for a few companies, but I've mostly been doing my own independent stuff.
Makes sense. So how do smaller developers, for example, market your game? As you said, Double 11 pretty much approached you, but let's just say if Double 11 hadn't approached you, how would that be? Is that a constant struggle, or is it one of those? It's a struggle to find a publisher, or how does that work?
Well, if I were to say anything about that, I would say, to developers, the first thing that is really the most important thing is to verify whether your game has an audience or not. And I think Kickstarter is an amazing way to do that. It doesn't matter how much you really raise on Kickstarter. If you have a successful Kickstarter, it says a lot about how people are willing to invest in what you're creating before it's even done. It's amazing. It's kind of unfair, actually, to the player, because sometimes their projects don't get released and they just invested in it. But then sometimes they're investing in something really cool that does get released, and they do get rewarded immensely from it. So I think Kickstarter is an amazing way to verify whether your game is worth your time. And I think a lot of developers spend years making their games, and then they try and put it out and see if it works. But I think that's kind of putting the cart before the horse. You really should verify whether people are going to want what you're creating before you create it all. And I would recommend doing that. And that's that's how a publisher contacted me, and that's how the press started writing about Songbringer too, is they saw the Kickstarter. So I think it's an amazing way to start building a following. In fact, you really need to build your own following before you do Kickstarter. You cannot just depend on Kickstarter to build your following for you. You've got to have something to start with. And so I recommend doing any kind of social media or grassroots indie marketing or something to build up a following along the way. Do a Kickstarter, and that will attract a lot of attention. If your Kickstarter is successful, you'll have publishers contacting you, and I think that's a great way to do it. And if not, if you're not going to go that route, there's other routes to go. Sure, you can go and try and shop your game around to publishers, and I wish developers good luck on that.
So how do you view yourself in the Hindi community? For example, what's your position? Do you consider yourself well-networked, hyper-visible? Or is that just a byproduct of, for example, Kickstarter and just having a really sort of interesting concept?
Well, I don't consider myself... So when I started Songbringer, I was like, well, I've made games before, but essentially I'm a no-name developer. No one's heard of me. And so that's why I started doing live streams, and I started doing these live streams and just interacting with people on a daily basis and saying hi and, connecting with people and sharing GIFs on Twitter and things like that. So, I do not consider myself hyper visible. Oh, in a sense, I am putting myself out there and showing the work from Songbringer on at least a weekly basis, if not a daily basis. And so, yeah, I guess I'm visible in a sense, but I wouldn't say I'm famous or anything at this point. I wouldn't say I'm yet a well-known developer, but I hope to one day be. And I think that, if anything, what I've done with this project is to show that you can go from zero to something.
So you live streamed the game pretty much throughout development. So what are some of the benefits you got out of it, apart from like tweaks to your game? And is it more efficient than, let's just say, coding in solitude, just sitting alone, working at it?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. It's very motivating to be doing live streams, because you're like, what am I going to show people next? Like, I got to have something to show, and also helps me to make progress. Like, okay, I want to make some progress so that I can show people some new stuff. But also, it's a sense of camaraderie that I wouldn't have alone otherwise, because there's no one else I get to work with. And so there's none of that fun stuff that comes along with, working in a team, like just playing games after work or going out to lunch together and things like that. It's really fun to have a team. And so I don't get that, but it helps to do live streams, because then I at least get to relate with people, joke about the newest stuff that's going on in the industry, see what new games are coming out, chat, stuff like that. And also it's really fun to just, work on my game live and get some stuff done too.
And what are some of the things you changed because of such an involved development process? Were there like clashes of ideas, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, well, not necessarily clashes of ideas, but a lot of great suggestions along the way. For example, one person mentioned, as I was starting to create the AI for the game, the enemies AI and stuff like that, someone said you should use behavior trees. And I'm like, what are those? And so I learned how to make behavior trees, and I wrote my own basically scripting language for Songbringer. And another great suggestion was crafting. Like, someone said you should be able to take things and craft them together or combine stuff. And at first I was kind of like, I don't know if I want to make like a Minecraft-y type game, but it turned out to be one of the coolest parts of Songbringer, is being able to take those 5 elements and craft them in a kind of unique ways and seeing what the heck happens. It might break the whole game, but let's see what happens. Let's try it.
So let's start. You mentioned how you have a lot of experience developing soundtracks. Can you tell us a little more about the soundtrack of Songbringer? Because it definitely feels very unique and not something we've typically heard in games before. So how does the soundtracks, for example, how do they change from world to world? Is there sort of like a set pattern to them? Just a little more about that.
Sure. Well, there's one pretty unique thing about Songbringer's soundtrack, and that is that all of the dungeons Well, first of all, it depends on your world seed. Your world seed is what gives your whole overworld layout, all the dungeon layouts, the order of the bosses, the order of the items. Everything depends on your world seed, but also the music depends on your world seed. So, in World Seed Peanut, for example, Dungeon 1 might have a key of C sharp, and then in some other world, Dungeon 1 might have a key of F sharp. So the rhythm to the music always stays the same. It's always basically the same song. It's just that the melody changes a little bit depending on what key it's in, which depends on the world seed. So the music feels a little bit different for each world. And then, one more thing about music is that it's adaptive too. So as you're going into different rooms, at first there's no drums. But whenever there's enemies, the drums kick in and things get more intense. And then also there's when you're fighting bosses, the drums get way more and more intense as the boss gets closer and closer to being defeated. So there's a lot of little elements that kind of make Songbringer's music feel unique.
So, for example, let's just say if someone who's playing the game for the first time, would you recommend paying attention to everything at the same time? For example, I know some games, if you just have to pay attention to the visuals, the soundtrack, and other sort of rhythm, tempo, aren't of much consequence. And in other games, that's pretty much what you have to focus on versus your immediate surroundings, unless you creep up on a boss. So, how should new players approach the game?
It's not critical to pay attention to the music, but it is helpful. So if you actually pay attention, there's a secret I'll give away here, and that's that basically if you pay attention to the audio, the music muffles, and all of the audio muffles when you're near secrets. So that's a good way to know, if you're paying really close attention in your headphones, or your sound system, you can say, oh, well, I must be near some kind of secret at this point because the music's muffled. And it's kind of a subtle thing. I mean, I've wrote all the music, and even sometimes I miss them. So, and then another thing is it really helps to pay attention to when you're fighting bosses, because you can know, because the bosses don't have any kind of health meters. There's no visual indicator for if the boss is almost dead. But the audio changes a lot. It gets way more frenetic and way more fast paced as the boss is closer to death. So it's a good way to know how much progress you've made in the boss fight.
Going on a little tangent off of the music, so going back to the algorithm again, how does it intelligently lay out maps? For example, there's certain logic to the game. For example, rivers connect across screens, and other rules are maintained pretty much no matter what you do. Is that limited to the seed, or is that somewhat sort of like a hierarchical sort of rule?
Yeah, so there's basically a lot of design rules that go into making the procedural world work. And so one of the first rules is that Dungeon 1 can only be a certain walking distance from the home screen. So the home screen is always the same location in the world. The world is always the same size. It's like a rectangle, and it's 16 by 8 screens. So that's what the overworld always is, the same shape, but it's a completely different layout. And so that first rule is okay, Dungeon 1 can only be from 4 to 6 different screens away from the home screen, so that you're always getting that first dungeon sort of within distance of the beginning. And then there's a lot more rules like that, where it just makes sure that the world that's being generated is playable, and it is something that feels a lot like a bespoke world. And and there's a lot of different layers to the generation. It generates a maze, it's actually not a 4-dimensional, but each area is broken up into 4 different quadrants. So there's this intricate little maze that gets generated for the whole overworld. And in the dungeons, we're completely different. The dungeon generator is something that is a lock and key puzzle generator. Basically, there's keys in the dungeons, and there's single-use keys, so you have to figure your way through the dungeon. So the generator has to know that if I place a key at the beginning of the dungeon, that can allow them to get through this one door, and then in the next section there's got to be another key and stuff like that. So there's a lot of, I'd say in the 3 years of development that I've developed Songbringer, there's probably 3 to 4 months worth of solid effort that's just gone into overworld and dungeon generation. I had another point to say about that, but I forgot it. I'm sorry.
Well, if it comes back, definitely share it with us. So, as you said, like, what are some of the inspirations driving the character concepts? For example, let's say, or like, what sort of like quirky people or other individuals do you meet, or is it somewhat like a solitary adventure between your character and Jib along the way?
So there's a whole your crew of your spaceship Songbringer is there. They're aboard your spaceship, so you get to go back and meet them. There's characters in the overworld. There's people that have been on the planet that you're on. There's of course the enemies, and they have stories too. They're not really told that much in the Songbringer plot, but we're planning some updates, and I think I'm going to be able to kind of integrate in a little bit more of some story for the backstory for the enemies. And then also there's these lore pillar things. If you meditate in front of these lore pillars, it gives you a little bit of backstory about the bosses. So there are a lot of characters, and there's like there are NPCs you can find, and yeah, every character kind of has their own little story.
So it's pretty much like the Legend of Zelda. You go around, talk to people, you kind of learn about them, but nothing's really sort of, you don't have to read paragraphs worth of text regarding, where certain villager A came from or villager B came from.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. It's not really like a Final Fantasy style like story. It's not super duper long and stuff like that. It's really more quick and small little story elements that you get. And then they also can kind of come in a different order each time you play. And maybe in some plays you're not going to get all the NPCs. Maybe in other plays you do, and you get them in out of order. So yeah, it's not a super duper in depth like long reading story where you're pressing A forever, but there is some story involved.
So, as you mentioned, items and finding items plays a major role in progression and how strong you become in order to take on the final boss. So could you talk about the combination of items in your inventory and how that works?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's, of course, the crafting. That's really important to realize that once you get those crafted, those items that can be crafted, it's pretty important to go craft them as soon as possible because you get powerful really fast. I mean, and then there's life containers. You want to get as many of those as you can. There's a couple quarter life containers. If you can find all those, you can craft another one. There's armors you can find which prevent damage from certain elements. So there's like a fire armor, there's an ice armor, there's an acid armor, and things like that. Those are kind of unique things that you should, if you can find them, they're really important to help you fight bosses easier. And then, yeah, I mean, I guess that's all I got to say about that. Did I answer that question all right?
You did. So I just wanted to expand upon the crafting. So is it easy to find recipes, or how does that work? Or are you just told how to craft items, or is it somewhat like a discovery process? For example, initially when Minecraft came out, we had no idea what we were doing, and we just had to experiment with everything and just hope for the best.
Yeah, so first of all, it's more like combining than crafting. So it's not really a recipe. It's only two things that go into each combination. So you take two items and they combine into one. And it is a process of it's meant to be a process of discovery, something that rewards you as a player. Like, oh, I just found out how to, what I could combine there. So when you're first presented with that choice of this area where you can craft things, it's really kind of meant to be a puzzle. Like, what do I do here? And you try some things out and you finally realize how to do it. So,
is there a way to, for example, let's just say like botch crafting, or is it pretty straightforward? Because
no, there's no way to botch it. Basically, if it doesn't work, the thing doing the crafting will tell you.
That's understandable. Going back to the example of Prince of Persia, I mean, even though it didn't have crafting or anything, but you weren't really sure of what, for example, there was the flask mechanic, and you weren't really sure how you know, which flask would actually. So there were red flasks, I believe there were blue flasks, and there were green flasks, and you came across one. It was pretty much up for gamble because you drink it, you lose life, you might die, you might, you know, you might run super fast or something. I'm obviously confusing the game. I haven't played it in years, but so it's good to know, you know, there aren't any surprises because I think in a game which is significantly difficult like Songbringer, you know, it's obviously a challenge. You kind of want to focus on becoming the best at fighting bosses or finding secrets. So I guess that would probably just lead to frustration.
Yeah, I do love that whole surprise element of that Prince of Persia thing, and it reminds me of Toe Jam and Earl when you have all these presents and you open up the present, and you're like, sometimes it's a really bad present, sometimes it's a really good present. But yeah, Songbringer is different in that you basically cannot get any bad items. I mean, really, fear is the only thing that kind of is different, but fear is powerful in its own right.
So, going towards like the end of our interview, so you mentioned how, you know, many developers have to gauge interests. What are some of the things you can do in game development that capture the interest, especially when you're creating single-player games? You know, nowadays everybody pretty much wants the next Call of Duty or the next sort of like the popular multiplayer shooter like Overwatch. So, what are some of the unique challenges nowadays, especially for indie developers, smaller developers, when it comes to really sort of making sure that gamers love the concept and approve of like your single player game?
Well, there's two different things there. There's concept and then there's implementation. When it comes to concept, I mean, what really helps concept and getting people sold on something is really good concept art. It's funny because it's the same word, but like concept art almost sells every single Kickstarter, it seems like I've seen. It's like if you have good concept art, it's a really good indicator if you're going to be like a good successful Kickstarter almost. But then when it comes to implementation, it's a lot different. So if you're actually trying to sell people on your video game, what really helps, I think, is to focus on atmosphere. If you're creating a world that really feels like you're there, like for example, Sword and Sorcery, amazing atmosphere. The second you start playing Sword and Sorcery, you feel like you're there. You're drawn into the world. You're immersed. And I think that can really help if you spend a lot of time on your game making sure it's really atmospheric to the most it possibly can be for your game. It'll help a lot.
I believe that is it for the questions we have today. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Anything we missed when talking about Songbringer? Obviously, you know, you've been working on this project for 3 years, so it's impossible to capture pretty much everything in the span of an hour almost. So. Yeah,
it is. Well, I mean, this has been a pretty thorough talk. I think we've covered every single base. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully our readers enjoyed the interview, and hopefully they'll check out Songbringer on September 1st on Xbox One, and I believe it's coming to PlayStation 4 on September 5th. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Asher. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.